My son is having an affair on the side. Here, the mother-in-law could barely hide her glee as she showed her daughter-in-law the photos. Jane looked at the photos only to get her mother-in-law to let go. This time the mother-in-law outdid herself and showed up at her office. Alright, now she would take one look at the stupid pictures and send Sandra away. Jane looked at the photos and her temples prickled. The photo was clearly taken in bed, albeit ineptly and amateurishly, with a floating focus, but it clearly showed her sleeping husband and some other woman. By the way, even quite a pretty face. What am I talking about? Jane thought aloofly. Nearby, the mother-in-law clucked sympathetically. Jane, I didn't even tell Boris, I went straight to you. Jane gathered the photos in a neat stack and said loudly and clearly. Congratulations Sandra, you've made it. Jane met Boris in a classic place, at a driving course. Not without reason all the guides and manuals how to meet a rich and successful man recommend girls to attend a driving course. However, Jane did not come to the course to get acquainted, but with the purpose of learning to drive a car, which she only planned to buy. Boris, too, did not come to the course to get acquainted, or even to learn how to drive a car that he had known how to drive for a long time. As it turned out later, he came to the building of the office center to clarify with its director some details on the major renovation of the 5th floor. So, Jane had met Boris in the most unromantic way, when she was arguing with her boss on the phone. No, Natalie, Jane said into the phone, no, I've already left work and I can't count anything today. No, they didn't tell me in advance. No, I'm on a course and I can't count without seeing the paperwork. No, I can't go back to work right now. Yes, of course, I'll do it as soon as I get in tomorrow. Jane disconnected and found a tall, handsome young man looking at her with a mocking smile. I respect employees like that, the young man said. One should speak politely but firmly to one's superiors. Jane was already scandalously late for the start of classes, but she could not resist and replied. Would you take such an employee to work if you were the boss? The young man answered without hesitation. Of course, I would, but alas, I am not the boss. Who is? Jane asked half-turned, heading for the elevator. Nothing, the young man dismissed her, an errand boy. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Already sitting at the desk and listening to something inaudible about the importance of ethics of driver and pedestrian, Jane scolded herself, a young man like that is asking for a date, and you, stupid, ran to the course. If you had skipped this lesson, nothing terrible would not have happened. But fate was favorable to Jane. The second time she ran into Boris was when she came to the class for the 5th time and found that this time it had been cancelled. Jane was standing in the middle of the hallway, trying to think of whether to quit the failed course altogether, go to make a scandal about the cancelled classes, or just go home and do some business, when a partially familiar young man came out of the elevator. Well, today you built the bosses? He asked. I have, Jane replied. Now I'm thinking about building the management of courses for car enthusiasts. Spit, advised the young man, let's go for a coffee. And these courses I advise you to quit. Why? Jane asked immediately out of a sense of contradiction. Because they occupy the cheapest space here and don't pay rent regularly. Are you the owner of this building? Jane asked immediately. Not at all, said the young man, let me introduce myself, Boris. I'm just repairing their roof and, as such, I know the approximate rates and the reputation of the tenants. So, you're a roofing contractor? Jane asked with a slight sneer. So, I am a representative of the construction company, Andrew and Company, answered the young man. So how about some coffee? Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Coffee with Boris smoothly turned into a walk, and the walk, into bed. What's the big deal? Boris turned out to be the son of the director of that very construction company and responsible for negotiations with customers. And after 2 months of acquaintance Jane moved into Boris's studio in a new neighborhood, and after another month Boris once said, I'm going to visit my parents tomorrow, let's go in together. Before the visit to Andrew and Sandra, Jane was quite nervous. She imagined various options, from go to the wedding immediately to why did you bring us this slut? Jane wasn't going to get married yet, it was more of a headache, and Boris hadn't called her yet. They weren't planning to have children in the near future, so Jane didn't see much point in this visit, but it was awkward to refuse. It didn't go the way Jane had envisioned. There was no formality, no "Mom, Dad, meet my fiancé." Boris introduced her in a general way. Boris's father talked to Jean simply as a good acquaintance. Mom immediately began to chirp with her as a crony friend. She discussed the latest trends in fashion, what is better to wear this season, what phone is better to buy, how much is a trip to the Maldives. Thank God, no pickles, no jams, no twists. Sandra turned out to be quite a modern lady, and looked not much older than Jane herself. Jane visited her husband's parents infrequently after that, only a couple of times. Once for the birthday of her mother-in-law, so she unofficially called Sandra, and the other time she just dropped in for a bite to eat. That said, she and Sandra talked at least 2 or 3 times a week. Mother-in-law called Jane all the time, asking why the app on her phone wasn't working, what shoes would be better to buy, what Jane thought about the political situation, what she thought, whether to take an umbrella and whether it would rain today, even though the weather forecasters hadn't promised it. The last question, which sounded in the middle of the meeting, she had forgotten to turn off the phone, completely annihilated Jean. She tried to answer her mother-in-law more dryly, referring to employment, but Sandra apparently finally decided to consider Jean her best friend, and maybe more. Then the unexpected happened. Boris's father died. He came home, sat on the sofa, and never got up. Sandra called Jane every 5 minutes, but she was sympathetic. After all, the death of a husband, and a relatively young one at that, is always a tragedy. Jane honestly discussed with her mother-in-law all the problems associated with the funeral, paperwork, choosing a coffin, ordering a wake, etc. But all things pass. The funeral passed. 40 days passed. Boris became the head of his father's firm. Jane moved from her position as deputy chief accountant to her husband's firm. First as an accountant, then as CFO. Everything seemed to be going well, but then Sandra became active again. She usually started her conversations in the same way. "Jane, you're a free man now, you're your own boss, you don't depend on your bosses, so we can have a chat." Another such call came after Jane had dealt with a very unpleasant situation with a contract that had been lost by her predecessor. Gritting her teeth and trying her best to banish the venomous snake intonation from her voice, Jane answered. "Yes, Sandra, I am a completely free man now. I work as a financial director in your son's firm. If I get distracted by talking to you and sign the wrong contract, the firm will suffer significant losses and maybe even be prosecuted. You and I both don't want that, do we?" Jane emphasized the last word in her voice. "Of course, we don't," Sandra agreed easily. "Jane, do you think it would be better to go to Turkey in September or wait until November?" "December 31st, Jane said gloomily. "For a year, or better for 3. And hung up. Jane wondered why Sandra was bothering her so much. Sometimes some of Sandra's questions stumped Jane. Why don't the two of us go on vacation together, sharing a hotel room? What kind of underwear Jane liked best? Jane even wondered if her mother-in-law was harassing her. But maybe, of course, Jane was mistaken and imagining things. Or maybe she wasn't. After the end of the working day, Jane couldn't stand it and told Boris everything. "Listen, but talk, after all, talk to your mother. Well, I cannot every day distracted by idle talk. After all, she must realize that it is in her interest that I work well." Boris waved it away. "Oh, don't mind her, she used to call my father the same way. It's just that Mom has that kind of personality, super social. Just answer something light, and then disconnect." Jane tried to follow Boris's advice, but it didn't work very well. Sandra, however, switched to calling after work, which Jane was not happy about, and finally, when her mother-in-law asked, "Jane, why aren't you picking up the phone again?" Jane couldn't take it anymore and barked. "I'm sitting on the toilet, I don't carry my cell phone all over the apartment with me." There was a lull. Sandra was clearly offended. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Sandra walked down the street and cherished her resentment. She treats this girl like her best friend, and this girl's got her nose up her ass. You see, she's the CFO. So, CFOs don't talk to people anymore? That's when she got the call. "Sandra, hello. How are you? I heard your husband passed away?" My condolences. And how is Boris? Sandra looked up. Betty was walking towards her. Betty had once studied together with Boris at the Faculty of Economics, had visited their home with other classmates and, as it seemed to Sandra, had even been in love with her son, but the feeling was not reciprocated by Boris. Sandra had not welcomed Betty as a future daughter-in-law, but now she thought she had been sent by God himself. Betty was immediately invited to visit, then again and again. Betty had a very successful job in a pension fund, and Sandra supposedly consulted with her about the pension. On one of these visits, Betty was inevitably met by Boris, who had stopped by to visit his mother. Boris was tired, irritated, the management of the firm was not the easiest job, and therefore the words of his mother fell on fertile ground. Here Betty, also an official, in a responsible position, but with a stranger is not squeamish to chat, and Jane extra time, how are you, lazy to say. The next time Boris went to his mother's house, Betty was there too. Betty nicely talked to Boris, did not burden him with any financial issues and incorrectly executed documents, and Boris decided that as a kind of psychological relief may well go with a former classmate for a couple of days to rest. Everything happened as Sandra had planned. Betty honestly fulfilled the agreement and sent Sandra frank pictures. And now Sandra was speaking sympathetically to Jane. This perverse, Boris's former classmate, showed up at my place and put it out there, I'm in love with Boris. It looks like my son has a connection on the side, here you can admire. Mother-in-law could barely hide her glee, showing her daughter-in-law the photos. But I didn't even tell Bora anything, so as not to upset him. And here I brought them for you, keep in mind. Her mother-in-law's voice was filled with such jubilant sympathy that Jane understood everything. Thank you, Sandra, she said dryly. You've been very kind. Now I'll ask you to leave the study. The door closed behind her mother-in-law. Jane opened the safe and scrutinized all the papers. She didn't touch the official contracts, accounting records, financial documents, but she carefully shoveled out all the papers where there were notes, where to call in case of emergency, which contracts were underformed, where there were problem areas, phone numbers of the right people, and so on and so forth. Jane carefully stuffed it all into her bag, put the compromising photos on the top shelf of the safe and in half an hour took the keys to the safe, office and apartment along with her resignation letter to the office of the director of the company and her ex-husband. 6 months passed. The new CFO had already managed to screw up at least twice. A new client, outraged, cancelled a very promising contract. After Jane's departure, Boris tried to maintain a relationship with Betty, but quickly became convinced that they simply had nothing to talk about. Boris carefully refrained from visiting his parents' apartment. Conversation with his mother lately consisted exclusively of her rhetorical questions. Why didn't you check the documents yourself in time? Why did you lose such a profitable client? Why did you break up with Betty? Where was your new CFO looking? Why did you break up with Jane? After the last question, Boris launched his smartphone at the wall. Boris had called Jane twice in the meantime. Once apologizing, the second time asking to meet to talk. Jane both times, having finished listening, silently hung up. Boris dialed Jane's phone on the new smartphone he had bought 5 minutes ago to replace the broken one. Jane, he said in a formal voice. Boris speaking. I invite you to the position of CFO of Andrew & Company, a salary of $5,000. I hope you will accept. Boris hoped Jane would answer him. She did respond. I'm sorry, Boris, I can't accept your extremely tempting offer. Unfortunately, I'm very busy right now, I'm drawing up the documents to move to England. Immediately after the divorce, Jane decided to make a radical change in her life, to move to another country and start there with a clean slate. She had long dreamed of living in Europe, and the choice fell on England with its mild climate and rich history. Jane took an active role in organizing the move. She applied for and received a work visa, found a prestigious job as a financial director in the London office of a large company. She also rented a small but charming apartment in a quiet neighborhood in Battersea. The flight itself and the first days in a foreign country were not easy. Jane was worried whether she would be able to adapt to the new orders, to make friends. But her fears were quickly dispelled. Her new colleagues were very friendly and helped Jane with advice. She quickly mastered the work and soon met new friends, the same young and motivated girls. After a couple of months, Jane felt at home in England. She loved morning walks in the park near home, going to the pub in the evenings, cozy London life. The move was a success, and now there was a bright, promising life ahead. After moving to London, Jane didn't want to meet anyone for a long time. The memories of Boris's betrayal were still fresh, and she did not want to repeat old mistakes. But after a year, loneliness made itself felt. One day on the subway, a man of about 35 caught her eye, reading the same book she had recently read. Jane dared to talk to him, and so a conversation ensued. The man's name was James. He too was an immigrant to London, working in IT. It turned out they had tons of common interests, from classical music to action sports. They began to meet for concerts and exhibitions, to go hiking. Jane felt unusually easy and comfortable in James's company. And after 6 months she realized that she was in love. Soon James proposed to her, and they were married in a small circle of friends. Now Jane knew that next to her reliable, loving man on whom you can always rely. And the turbulent past already seemed to her a distant dream. Jane and James had been living in London for 6 years. They were happily married and had 2 children, a 5-year-old son and a 3-year-old daughter. Jane was a successful financial director in a large company, and James was a successful computer programmer. One day Jane received a text message from Boris. He wrote that he was divorcing Betty and that he wanted to meet Jane. Jane thought for a long time whether she should reply to the message. She still remembered Boris's betrayal, but on the other hand, she was curious about what had happened in his life. In the end, Jane decided to answer the letter. She wrote to Boris that she was ready to meet him, but only in London. They met in a cafe. Boris looked older and aged. He apologized to Jane for what he had done. He said that he had been young and foolish, and that he now realized that he had lost the most precious thing he had. Jane listened to Boris, but did not reciprocate. She said that his apology was accepted, but that their relationship was no longer possible. Jane and Boris parted as friends. They talked about what had happened in their lives over the past 6 years. Jane told Boris about her marriage and children, and Boris told Jane about his work and how he was coping with the divorce. After meeting with Boris, Jane felt lighter. She realized that the past was behind her and that she could move on. But what became of Sandra? After Jane left the company, Sandra was left all alone. Her son, whom she had always considered a pillar of support and hope, had now turned his back on her. Her friend, Betty, was also unsupportive when she learned that Sandra had been involved in the rift in Boris and Jane's family. Sandra was devastated. She didn't understand how she could have made such a mistake. She thought she was doing everything for her son's happiness, but she ended up losing him. Sandra began to reflect on her life. She realized that she had always been a selfish and controlling woman. She never thought about the feelings of others, including the feelings of her son. Sandra decided to change. She started seeing a therapist to sort out her problems. She also started doing charity work to help other people. Gradually, Sandra began to mend her ways. She became more empathetic and responsive. She learned to appreciate people close to her and to forgive them. After a few years, Sandra was able to restore her relationship with her son. Boris realized that his mother had changed, and he forgave her. Sandra also resumed communication with Betty. They became new friends and supported each other. Sandra lived a long and happy life. She became a respected person in her community. She was always helping those in need and striving to make the world a better place. And as it turned out, she didn't harass Jane at all, she just needed a friend, companionship and understanding.